Okay, so the First Amendment, all of the amendments are very important in their own way. Third Amendment ended up being maybe not quite as important as people expected, certainly in the 20th and 21st century. All the amendments, though, very important, but the First Amendment definitely a very significant one. Okay, so right at the beginning, first one, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to assembly. Okay, and these all kind of combine, underlying them, or what really unifies all of them and brings them all together is the notion of freedom of conscience, okay? So this kind of goes back to what we talked about when we talked about Thomas Jefferson and some of his arguments for religious freedom. A lot of it is the government cannot tell you what to believe. And it can't do that either by trying to force you to practice or subscribe to a particular religion or to publicly affirm a set of beliefs. And it can't really do that by trying to discourage you or make it harder to practice the religion that you think is true, okay? A lot of it goes back to those ideas that he gave, really good expression to. Each individual has to find out the truth for themselves. The government cannot push them in one direction or even nudge them along, really, okay? And most fundamentally, that's true about the really important things. Does God exist? What's the ultimate nature of reality and of our existence as human beings and so on? Those really fundamental questions, which are religion is one form in which the answer takes, one form that the answer takes, but those sorts of questions really fundamentally important. And then the way to talk about them, through freedom of speech, through press, right, through publishing your ideas, as well as also important, but maybe a little bit less significant, questions of politics. Obviously, you don't want people to not be able to speak their mind on political things because the government has suppressed them from doing that. You want people to be able to hear different points of view and understand them. And then freedom of assembly, of course, is the ability for people to publicly gather, right? And to express these things in part maybe so they can know their own strength, right? So they can actually come out and see how many people feel this way. But also, again, so that they can say these things publicly and appear publicly and not be put in jail for that, okay? So I will read it real quick, okay? Again, all of these things kind of unified by the concept of freedom of conscience, that fundamental importance that the government can't tell us what is true or can't try to make us believe something or stop us from believing something. And then what is it like? How do most people figure out what is true? How do they come to understand these things for themselves? Well, usually from hearing what other people think as well, right? So therefore, freedom of the press, freedom of the speech, the ability of people to freely say these things is very important, somewhat subordinate to that ultimate goal of being able to understand the truth for yourself and so on. So I will read it real quick and we will go over the different parts of it and the way that they have been interpreted over time. Okay, so Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Okay, and notice also this is specifically about Congress, okay, and therefore the federal government, and therefore ultimately or eventually, as we know, through the incorporation doctrine, the states, but it's about the government. It's not necessarily about private individuals, private companies. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we talk about freedom of expression, okay? Some of these things, freedom of religion, yeah, companies cannot fire you for your religious beliefs. If you are hired someplace, first of all, they can't refuse to hire you because you practice a particular religion. If they hire you and you're a Baptist and you convert to Islam or to Buddhism, they can't fire you for that. Other things involving speech are more limited by your employer possibly, and also privately owned social media companies. That's been controversial recently. They have the right, of course, to set terms of service and conditions and so on, and to make different decisions. The situation may not be good, but that doesn't mean that it's unconstitutional or that it's a First Amendment issue, right? Lots of things are legal, but not very good. So remember when you're talking about the First Amendment, you're talking specifically about the government. You may think that you need a concept of free speech that involves more than just that, and that's a fair argument to make, but that's no longer the First Amendment, okay? So First Amendment, again, we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about freedom of expression here. First Amendment, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, expression, the press, and then the right of assembly, okay? So and notice that there are two different clauses here, okay? First of all, it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, okay? So the first one is called the Establishment Clause. The second is called the Free Exercise Clause. And those kind of deal with two different aspects of freedom of religion, okay? The notion of an establishment of religion means that the government is going to basically pick a religion and try to promote it in one way or another. It may be that that religion gets certain tax breaks or certain other advantages that other religions don't get. It may be that to be a member of the federal government, you need to be a member of a particular church or a particular religion, okay? But one way or the other, the notion of establishment, of religious establishment, is that the government promotes a particular religion. And of course, at the time, it might have had to do with different sects or different denominations of Christianity. As time goes on, you have all kinds of different religions in the United States, and you even have the question of, you know, religious people versus non-religious people, okay? And remember, some of those also go back to some of those arguments that Jefferson made about how tying up religion and government in some way tends to debase religion. By having the government support a particular church or having a particular church be the path to political power, among other problems that creates, it really kind of debases the religion because it draws people to it for the wrong reason, okay? So let's start with the Establishment Clause. There's always been a bit of a debate. What does that mean exactly? Thomas Jefferson said there's a wall of separation, that that's what it means, that's what it should mean. There should be an absolute wall with, you know, religion on one side, government on the other, no overlap, no connection at all. And then there's a kind of a more moderate or more modest or more less thoroughgoing interpretation of it, which basically says all that it really prohibits is the official establishment of a religion, okay? But the key point for the way that it's been interpreted over time in the 20th century into the 21st, obviously it forbids the establishment of a religion by the government, Congress, federal government, and then again, ultimately the states through the incorporation doctrine. So it forbids the establishment of one religion, the promotion of one religion by the government, and therefore it also prohibits hostility towards any. So the term that is often used is accommodation, okay? If government is going to get involved with a particular religion, whether it's a particular church, a particular denomination of Christianity, or Christianity itself, or religion, the idea of belief in God, it needs to accommodate all religions, okay? Now, what is a reasonable accommodation varies from one situation to another, okay? But the basic principle is accommodation, okay? So what does this mean in practice? Again, more recently, especially the 20th into the 21st century here, 20 years into it. The Lemon Test, that was something that was developed by the Supreme Court specifically, and this is one thing that comes up a lot with questions of funding for religious schools, right? So you have some schools that have an explicitly religious character. Part of what they're doing is educating the students in a particular religion, and they receive government money. So I was just saying the government cannot establish or cannot promote a religion. How can they give money to a religious school? The Supreme Court came up with something, you know, a set of tests. They didn't call it the Lemon Test, but it's from a case involving someone named Lemon. So the test that they came up with was if government money is being used for, say, a religious school, a religious hospital, some other thing like that, something that is not a church itself, not the actual physical church, or something that has a purely religious purpose, but something else, in what way can it be used? What are the limitations on how government funding can be used, okay? First of all, it has to have a secular legislative purpose. So again, to keep this simple, we will stick with schools educating children, certainly in math, English, science, etc. This has a clear secular legislative purpose. In this way, a religious school may very well be doing the same thing as a public school, okay? So must have a secular legislative purpose. It must have a primary effect that neither advances nor inhibits religion. So its primary effect, the main thing that it does, can neither advance nor inhibit religion. That's a bit more of a judgment call maybe, but again, if it's being used to buy English textbooks or math textbooks, or, you know, to buy school lunches or something to feed kids, that is not something that primarily either advances or inhibits religion. And then must not foster an excessive government entanglement with religion. That one obviously is much more open to interpretation. What exactly is an entanglement with religion? When does it become excessive? But again, as we've seen with the Constitution, so with Supreme Court decisions, sometimes they can be very specific about particular questions, okay? But then when they're articulating or enunciating their principles that they're using, they're often a little bit more broad because, again, you don't want them to come back next year with a slightly different case. You want a set of principles that can be applied to many future cases, and sometimes there's going to be a little bit of interpretation. And sometimes people may need to come back and say, okay, how does the Lemon test apply to this particular case? New case, maybe it has to go all the way to the Supreme Court and the justices on it then. It might be 20 years after the original decision. You might have mostly or all different Supreme Court justices, and they may have to decide, okay, this is how this applies here. Is this particular case that we're ruling on now, is this an excessive government entanglement with religion, okay? So buildings, textbooks, lunches, and so on, federal funds, public funds, government funds can be used for that, not for things like, field trips, things that have a clear, primarily religious purpose. So not for religious education in the school, okay? Lemon test, something that comes up, every so often, especially for following things that Supreme Court cases, questions about whether government money, public money can be used for certain, everything from schools to hospitals to a parking lot. Okay, so religion in public schools, school prayer, relatively simple, okay? So compulsory or sponsored or encouraged prayer is not allowed, okay? So the notion is that anybody who has any kind of authority in the high school or any school, a teacher, an administrator, a principal, some other administrator, a coach, anybody, all of these people have some kind of authority, okay? So obviously if they require school prayer, they're putting pressure on the students to go along. And especially when you're talking about people under 18, obviously the smaller the child, the harder it's going to be for them to resist an authority figure. But even a 17-year-old, you're not legally an adult yet, and you're in this situation, you've been in institutions of all your life where you have, different authority figures. So it's even harder. Obviously, in a workplace, it might be difficult for you to, if your boss is doing something that you think is clearly inappropriate or illegal or something, it might still be difficult for you to challenge them. Even more so in school, right? When you're dealing with people who are not adults yet. So the notion is school prayer, anybody encouraging, so obviously compulsory, obviously a teacher or a principal or a coach or somebody like that requiring students to pray with them. Violates the First Amendment, because obviously, again, we're talking about public schools, okay? They are agents of the state. They are ultimately representatives of the state. They're paid for by the state. They are carrying out a clear governmental purpose, public education. So as a representative of the state, they cannot require prayer. And again, they also can't sponsor or encourage it because, again, the notion is, especially young people, very hard for them to resist that. So again, think about their freedom of conscience, their right to decide for themselves what they believe is true, what religions they believe are true or not true, and which religious practices they want to engage in. They can't really do that if an authority figure who has influence over their grades and over their graduation and whether or not they're going to play in the game and so on, but also just has that kind of institutional authority, is pressuring them even very subtly to engage in these things, okay? So the Supreme Court has made it very clear school prayer is not allowed. However, a private moment of silence is allowed. Okay, so private silent prayer is allowed, okay? So you can't have a teacher or a principal requiring prayer at the beginning of the day. But if you have a brief little period there at the beginning of the day when, homeroom or whatever, nothing's really going on, the student wants to stop and pray, you can't stop them. You can't quietly, right? If they're shouting at other people, then it's a discipline issue. But if somebody wants to privately, silently pray at their desk, the teacher can't say, hey, you're not allowed to do that. This is a public school. Okay, in a moment of silence, schools can begin, or a class can begin with a moment of silence where people can do whatever. Okay, originally there was an attempt, I think it was Alabama was the state that instituted a moment of silence in their public schools. And during the debate, they made it very clear they were trying to sort of smuggle prayer back into school. They were going to create a moment of silence, but really the teachers would use it to push prayer on the kids. The Supreme Court struck it down because it was kind of public and obvious why they were doing it. However, other forms would have been okay. A genuine moment of silence is okay. People can reflect, they can pray, they can do whatever they want to, okay? So religion in public schools, school prayer not allowed. Anything that is compulsory or encouraged by an authority figure, not allowed. Private, silent, individual prayer, that is allowed. And again, you can't stop it because it's a public school. Moment of silence is constitutional. That is okay, as long as it's genuinely a moment of silence in which people can reflect in whatever way, or pray if they want to, or do whatever they want to at that moment. Also, public schools cannot deny religious groups the same opportunities or the venues or whatever that they give other organizations, okay? So they can't promote a particular organization, they can't promote give a religious group opportunities that other groups don't have, but they can't deny religious groups particular opportunities just because they're religious, okay? So those are the details of religion in public schools. I know from teaching face-to-face, not always followed. Not the Supreme Court would not be happy with everything that happens in public schools all the time. But okay, so again, the basic principle here, the basic idea: establishment is forbidden. That the government cannot establish a religion either through a law saying this is the official church of the United States or the state of Georgia or Oklahoma or whatever. And hostility is forbidden. So again, you can't say you're not allowed to practice this religion, or people who practice this religion can't be members of Congress or something like that. Therefore, the notion is accommodation is required. If the government gives some kind of benefit to one religion, it has to give it to all religions. So no establishment, no hostility, therefore the positive principle, accommodation. Okay, so that is the establishment clause. Remember, there's also the free exercise clause. And that basically says that the government, Congress, therefore the federal government generally, and therefore ultimately the states through the incorporation doctrine, cannot interfere with the free exercise of religion, okay? So what does that mean in practice? What it means is that a lot of things that might be religious practices, you can still make illegal, okay? If somebody says that their religion requires human sacrifice, you can, obviously there's already a law against murder, so they can't do that. If they say that their religion requires the use of certain drugs that are illegal, those things are already illegal. However, you cannot take something that would be legal in other situations and try to make it illegal if it's used for a religious purpose, okay? So first of all, obviously the government cannot say you can't practice this religion. You know, you can't be Muslim, or you can't be Presbyterian, or you can't be Theravada Buddhist. And they also can't prohibit the actual exercise of the religion, the practices, the things that you would have to do to practice those religions. So they can't say, you know, you can't pray in this way, or you can't go to these types of buildings or these types of, you know, churches or temples or whatever, okay? So obviously they can't directly do that, but they also can't target particular things that might be unusual and when they're used in a religious context. So a somewhat recent example, there was went to the Supreme Court a case called, I think it was Hialeah County versus the Church of Santeria. Okay, Santeria is a religion that kind of combines elements of Christianity with elements of traditional Caribbean and African religions. It uses animal sacrifices. So this county in Florida, there was a Church of Santeria. They found out that they were doing animal sacrifices, and the people got a little bit nervous or uncomfortable. They didn't like the idea of animal sacrifices. So they passed a law against animal sacrifices. The Church of Santeria challenged it and said, lots of people are killing animals in this county. We're being singled out for doing something for a religious purpose just because they don't like our religion or they don't like what we're doing here. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, yeah, that's right. You cannot prohibit animal sacrifice if you allow slaughterhouses and hunting, and they were sacrificing the animals in a humane way, the same way you would in a slaughterhouse. So if there were an animal cruelty law that they were violating, you could intervene for that reason. If you want to have a vegan county or an animal rights county where no one is ever allowed to kill an animal for any reason, you can do that. What you can't do is say you can kill an animal to make a cheeseburger, you can kill an animal if you're hunting, but you cannot kill it if it's part of a religious ceremony, because we don't like that idea, okay? So basically anything that targets the free exercise of religion is unconstitutional. It violates the First Amendment. Again, certain actions, certain practices, certain things that are already illegal, you know, murder, drug use, theft, right? You can't say, well, my religion requires me to take this from this store, refuse to pay my taxes, or do other things that are already illegal. But things that are legal that people may not like if they're being done in a religious context, right? As marijuana becomes legal, maybe some people start using that for religious purposes. Maybe a government, a state government says, you know what, we're fine with marijuana being legal for recreational purposes, but the notion that that's something you do in a religious context or that it has a specifically religious meaning for some people, we don't like that. So you can't smoke marijuana as part of a religious ceremony. That would violate the free exercise clause, okay? If you're letting people do it in other contexts, you can't step in and try to stop it in a religious context because you don't like that idea or you don't like this particular religion and its practices, okay? Again, things that are already legal, that are already illegal, no problem. So kind of the principle here with all of this, people have an inviolable right to believe what they want, but not always to practice their beliefs. Again, human sacrifices, certain types of drug use, etc. You can believe whatever you want to. The government can never make you believe that something is wrong or bad or something like that, but you're not necessarily free to practice it, okay? And that is sort of the basic idea underlying the free exercise clause. Can't target a practice because it's solely in a religious context because you don't like it. But many practices that are already illegal, obviously you cannot do them and then claim that it's okay because you're doing it for a religious purpose. But also then again, the government cannot tell you what to believe. That right to believe what you think is right and true, that's absolute, but you are not always able to practice the belief the way that you may want to.